Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel where I simplify tech, and in this video today I'll be simplifying the useMemo hook. So first of all, the useMemo hook. The useMemo hook is used for memoizing values in React components. Now, why would you want to memorize values, or how exactly do you memorize values? And the rest of this video I'll be showing using this project. I'll be explaining use cases for memoizing values in React components, as well as letting you know when you should memorize and when you shouldn't. I'll be using this project. This is a React project created with Create React app, and I only made some few changes here just so we have this UI. So first off, let me explain the flow in this code. So these two are from the React boilerplate, the Create React app boilerplate. I have my use states hook here, and then I have this post array. Now this post array can be anything. It could be probably coming from a server. It could be hard coded here. We're just going to assume that there are a couple of posts here. And then there is this filter post function, which, as you'd guess, it filters the posts based on the query, and then it returns the filtered post. I also have this log here, just so when we call the filter post, we can see running function, and we'll see the relevance of this as we proceed in the video. Now in my app component here, I have two states, the count state and the query state. This is initialized to 0 and this is an empty string. And then I have this increment function here, which when called, increments the count state by 1. And then I have this filtered variable here, which calls the filter post based on the query state. So we get the filtered post, and then the only thing I'm using this filtered post here is logging it to the console. I am not using it in the UI. And then in the UI, I have this button here, which when clicked calls the increment function. And then I have this input here, which when the values change, I call the set query method. And back here in the UI, we can see when we refresh, we can see running function is called because the component mounts, the filtered posts are logged there. When we call on inc, this increments, and when we also type the query state is called, and that happens. So the first thing we want to understand before we understand where useMemo comes into play is the useState hook in React. Now in the useState hook, whenever you try to update a state, the whole component here is re-rendered. And what this means is, for example, if we update the state of count, it means this increment function is redeclared with the new count state. This filtered variable here is recomputed. This is also relogged again, and then we have the updated state in the UI. So this whole component re-renders. And the downside to this is every computation, everything we are doing in this component happens again when the state is updated. And one reason why we wouldn't want this to happen, especially in our project here, is if you look at filtered post has no relationship with the count state. The only thing it uses, or the only thing it depends on, is the query state, which means when you update the count state, we are running this function again, which can even be slow or expensive, and we wouldn't want that to happen. We only want the filter post to run when it has to, and when it has to here means when the query state changes. So if the query state never changes, the filtered post has to stay as it is, even though the whole component is re-rendered. And this is where we memorize the value of filtered. And this is where we introduce, this is the first use case where we introduce our useMemo hook. So the syntax of the useMemo hook is like this. So we have useMemo, we have a callback function here, and we have a dependency here, and that's just GitHub Copilot helping me suggest things, so I'm just going to ignore that. So this is a syntax, and here we're going to return a value, and whatever we return here is what gets assigned to the filtered object and is also to the filtered variable and is also memoized. So what we want to return here is this calling the filter post with the query state. And then our dependency here is going to be query. So what we're basically saying here is memorize the value of filtered. Don't run filter post every time there is a state change or there is a re-render. Memorize that value until the query state changes. So whenever the query state changes, then it rememorizes. If the query state changes again, it rememorizes. Oh, that's a lot to pronounce for me. So we have this, we have the useMemo. Back in our UI, when we refresh, the component is mounted. We have running function here. Now when we call on inc, which calls the count state, we can see running function is no longer logged, which means the function is not revoked, and we only have the filtered log here. When we increment again, we have this. Now when we call on the query state by changing the value in the input here, we can see running function is logged, which means that function is called again. But when we call on this, the running function is no longer logged. So this is the first use case, because filter post can be like an expensive function, can take a lot of time, and we don't want to do that when we don't have to. So this is the first use case of useMemo. At the end of this video, I'll let you know when you should use it and when you shouldn't, but this is the first use case for ensuring that computed values only get recomputed during re-rendering when they have to. Now the second use case of useMemo is for object references. So as you probably already know, in JavaScript, primitive values like 1 or strings, hello, are equal to themselves, right? But then when you have references like objects, object 1 is never equal to object 2. And the reason for this is these are primitive values, but these are reference values. And in reference values, even if let's say we have object 1 to be this, and we have object 2 to be this. Now, even though object 1 and object 2 both have empty values, they have different references. So obj1 would not be equal to obj2. Now, where exactly do we need useMemo in this? So let's say, for example, we have this object, and this object has a property called isFiltered, and isFiltered is going to check the query.length, and if the query.length is greater than 0, it means the posts are filtered, they are not the original post, and if it is not, it's false. And we want to have this use effect where we probably do something with this obj object. So the only thing I'm doing here is just console login filter status changed, for example, and the dependency of this use effect is going to be obj. So whenever this obj object changes, we want to log this. Now, without using useMemo here, let's see what happens. Oh my god, I have errors. Okay, yeah, I just knew this error was going to come out. There's a mix-up here and I keep getting wrong imports. So when we go back to the UI, we can see filter status change is logged on mount. When we increment this, we can see filter status change is logged even when our query hasn't changed. And the reason for this is when useEffect tries to compare this obj with the new obj that is created in the second render, it is not equal, and that is because they have different references. So what we want to do here now is to memorize the value of obj, still following the same syntax, use memo, and we return something here, and then we have this dependency. I'm going to bring this here and bring this here. So what we want to do here is to put this here, and the dependency for this, the obj depends on the query. So basically what we're going to do here is we're going to memoize this obj value until the query changes. Now when you go back here and you refresh, you can see filter status change when a component mounts. When we increase the count, we don't get a filter status change because we don't need to. And that's, as you can see, now we can easily, since the reference value of this is retained, there is no new object declared. But then when you change this, you can have filter status changed. So those are the two use cases of useMemo. Number one, to memorize values just so you recompute them only when needed during state changes or re-renders. And the second use case is when you are comparing object references. Since references change on re-renders, you want to ensure that the reference is the same. So those are the two use cases. Now, when should you use useMemo? useMemo can be very fun to use, and of course you may want to use it everywhere, but what I would advise, which I believe is the most conventional approach or general advice, is whenever you have a very expensive function, let's say filter post is doing a lot, or let's say there's like 1,000 posts, that's a really good time to use useMemo. But you shouldn't use useMemo just because you don't want re-renders, even when a function is not very expensive. And the reason is this: useMemo is actually storing your values somewhere in memory until it needs to be changed. And if you're using useMemo all through your application, that means more memory usage, and more memory usage can impact your application. So you want to ensure that even if you want to improve user experience by not rerunning things when you don't want to rerun them, make sure that it's only when you actually need to. And if it's just a simple function that does little calculations, then rerunning that function or re-executing that function wouldn't be that costly. So that's it for the useMemo hook. See you in my next video.